Welcome to Spiritual Foundations for Life. This is day number 208. Moses had no small task ahead of him. He had led the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt, but now he had the overwhelming task of leading them through the wilderness and into the promised land. God guided them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and he supplied manna from heaven for their nourishment. However, the desert was very difficult, and there was no modern day camping accommodations for 5 million people who would eventually wander the desert for 40 years. Moses, realizing the great size of the task, had two requests of God. In Exodus chapter 33, verses 12 and 13, Moses said to God, "You've been telling me lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. And if you are pleased with me, teach me your ways." These are the two most critical issues in every Christian's journey. Who's going with me? And how can I know your ways? Who's going with me? And Lord, I want to know your ways. How did God respond to Moses? He answered, he said, "My presence is going to go with you, and I will give you rest." See, guiding 5 million complaining people across a barren desert for 40 years would not seem like anyone's idea of rest. You know, and yeah, a dog may appreciate the same meal every day, but most people don't. And they got manna for 40 years. The only way to determine the quality of rest is to ask how we feel at the end of the rest. According to Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 7, which described Moses' 40 years later, okay, at the end of that 40 years, when he looked back on the promised land, here's what it says: Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. God had given Moses rest, but he didn't know he had rest until he looked back on those 40 years and said, "I'm not tired. I'm not weak." See, God had given Moses rest, but however, biblical rest is not ceasing from labor, and neither is it abandoning our responsibility. Biblical rest is living God's way by faith and being empowered by his presence. The alternative is to live our way in our own strength, which leads to burnout. Under the Old Covenant, God provided rest for his people by setting aside 1 day per week when no work was to be done, according to Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. Even the land was to lie dormant every seventh year, according to Leviticus chapter 25, verses 1 to 7. This need for rest is still necessary for our bodies, but the Old Covenant law was just a shadow of something far greater to come. Under the new covenant in Christ, we find rest for our souls. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, "Come to me, all you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Jesus is inviting us to come into his presence and learn his ways, learn from him, so that we can find rest for our souls, according to Matthew chapter 11, verses 29 and 30. Because his ways are not hard, and his burden is indeed light. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 to 3 says, "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have the good news proclaimed to us. Now we who have believed enter that rest." See, God's work is finished, and we have the privilege to rest in the finished work of Christ. If we find ourselves huffing and puffing our way into burnout, we need to remember God's promise. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 to 11, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters into God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter into that rest." Our key point is that biblical rest is living God's way by faith, empowered by his presence. And our key verse, Psalm 62, verses 1 and 2, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He's my fortress, and I will never be shaken. God bless you. See you tomorrow for another episode of Spiritual Foundations for Life.